Perfect. I think we can start. Welcome virtually from the New York Climate Week. This is the event called Mobilizing Finance for Regional Just Transitions from Coal. The event is hosted by the EU Initiative for Coal Regions in Transition. My name is Andrzej Błachowicz. I am the lead for international engagement in the secretariat of that initiative. Many thanks for everybody to join us. I also want to thank my colleague Coltrane, who has done tremendous work in putting this event together. Thank you very much, Coltrane. If we could move to the agenda for today, you can see we have an hour and a half. Agenda is quite packed. I guess this is usual thing. We try to give you as much as possible of interesting knowledge and insights. You see we have basically 3 or 4 actually components. We start with opening remarks from Veronique, who represents the Energy Department of the European Commission, who is the host of the initiative. And then we'll have a few words about justice, energy justice from Raphael Heffron. And then we have a panel of case studies. And I think this is ultimately the most important part of this dialogue, is to just hear from practitioners from concrete regions. And finally, we have an intervention from civil society, from Bernadette, representing Fair Finance Asia. My plan is to perhaps leave slightly over 20 minutes for Q&As. You can use the chat function, but you can also use Q&A function of the Zoom. We won't be allowing sort of live intervention, so please post all your questions. We try to answer some of them live. If not, then we may also get back to you after the event. One other piece of housekeeping information is that the event is being recorded, and you could yourself rewatch or share it maybe with colleagues going to YouTube and to the YouTube channel of the DG Energy. You basically type in EU Energy. We'll show that on the concluding slide. I think without further ado, let me turn to Veronique from the European Commission, and Veronique will tell you more about the Coal Regions in Transition initiative, but above all, why this subject is important, and also why it is important from the European perspective. Veronique, over to you.
Thank you, Andrew. Can you hear me?
Very well.
Works. Okay, thank you. Well, good afternoon, or I don't know where you are. Good morning to everyone. Thank you for joining this webinar. I'm Veronique Marx. I'm working on Just Transition at the Director General for Energy of the European Commission, and we are financing this initiative, and so very pleased to see many of you here today. So Just Transition, you're probably aware, is a key principle of the European Commission's of the EU's energy policies, especially the climate and energy policy. And the principle, as really one of the fundamental principles of the policies, really took momentum in the late 2010s, when the first member states took formal commitments to phase out coal from their energy mix. And so, of course, the question came, we are phasing out coal, but that means that some regions or some population groups will be more impacted by these decisions than others, and we need to make sure that we are not leaving them behind in this process, in this transition. And that's when also this initiative took off, when it started. So it was really formally established in 2017 to support the European coal, peat and oil shale regions in their transitioning away from fossil fuels. The initiative covers now 31 regions in 11 member states. So we have more and more member states who are becoming coal-free. And the objective is really about supporting the stakeholders of those regions, so not just public civil servants, but really stakeholders also from the private sector and from civil society, to share their knowledge and experiences on the transition, on the economic diversification towards more cleaner industries and technologies, to bring them together in platforms so that they can exchange, to organize exchanges, and to provide them with technical assistance and knowledge sharing on these topics. So as you can see on the slides, there's various activities that are included in this initiative. The webinar is one of them, but so we organize regular meetings and exchange forums. Particularly now, I already announced that will be the Just Transition platform meeting that takes place normally twice a year. So the next one will take place on the 15th and the 16th of October, and I welcome you very much to sign up to that. It's physically in Brussels, but you can also follow it online. We also produce knowledge projects. You can find all of them on our website. There's very many interesting case studies in there, but also the recordings of webinars or toolkits. We provide technical start to communities, to regions on specific topics. A new phase of this technical assistance will be starting in the next weeks. We had also an exchange program, which now is finished, but which supported the different regions to meet together around specific topics of their choice. And then, of course, we also engage internationally with outreach and exchange with non-EU regions on these very important topics. But so when we come now to the topic of this webinar, so the mobilizing the finance for a regional just transition away from coal, it's very well. It's quite obvious that such a big transition is very costly. It's a costly transition because it doesn't only encompass technological changes or investments, but it also requires investments into social, economic, and institutional transformation. That includes costs linked to funding for new labor, for new skills, for the communities included, for new economic diversification, green technology investments, but also investments linked, for example, to the decarbonization of district heating systems and so on. So all of this is very costly. I mean, the estimates are that in Europe, to achieve net zero emissions by 2050 will require around 28 trillion euros in clean technologies in the next years. And only in the power sector alone, we expect we need investments, annual investments of up to 100 billion to decarbonize by 2045. And clearly, when you look at those figures, it's impossible that this can be just financed by public finances. Public finances are very important, but they can never be sufficient to cover all these costs, and they shouldn't be sufficient for that. National and EU budgets are constrained, and so we need the private sector to be much more heavily invested in this transition and be a source of finance. So this is a little bit in a nutshell on why we think such a webinar and the topic is very important, and we very much look forward to listening to the discussion and also hear from you as participants. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Veronique. And just in terms of the flow, so we just keep moving to the next speakers, and we leave all the questions and discussion to the end. So thanks for that introduction. Please post any reactions to the chat box. We posted a couple of links to the things Veronique was mentioning, especially the Just Transition Platform conference that is happening in like 3 weeks' time. So hopefully many of you can join us virtually, and yeah, it's a super enriching event, I can tell you. Thank you so much. So without further ado, let's move on to Raphael Heffron. His intervention will serve as a sort of intellectual introduction to the conversation, specifically to talk about how principles of energy justice can be incorporated in practice in some policy and investment frameworks. I think that's what we don't want to lose, that dimension, talking about the financing of just transition. Raphael, over to you, and thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you, and thank you very much to Climate Strategies for organizing this event and to the team. So I'm going to talk about basically putting those justice issues into finance and decision making, and in essence how we've sort of gone from academic theory into policy making. Next slide, thanks. So I won't say too much about myself, but just to say that some of my research or my profile is in the top 2% of scientists worldwide in the recent Elsevier Stanford rankings. But also I've received funding for my work of a range of different institutions: European Commission, Asian Development Bank, African Development Bank, USAID, among others. And this you will see you'll see from my research perspective that it is very international. So I want to give you that appreciation that these principles are being infused into policy designs around the world. Next slide, thank you. So, initially we do live in an age of justice, and I just wanted to mention that in the context of, the upcoming climate change talks, the UN chief has said precisely those words, that we live in an age of justice. And just to highlight, as we look to UN COP29 later this year, that one of the significant developments for me will be the creation of what's referred to as a justice pathway. So as well as energy and climate targets that should be produced for these talks every year or updated, we will also now be thinking of how is justice updated. And also from a research perspective, you can see all the key interdisciplinary journals are all publishing on this topic. Next slide. So when we think of justice, we can think very briefly about the 5 key principles: distributive, procedural, restorative, recognition, and cosmopolitan. And I'll just go through these very quickly so you have that element of a theoretical background. Distributive is around the finance system, which we're highlighting today, but it's important also to remember the other justices. Procedural, about the legal system, where you create the legal architecture or the rules of the game. Restorative, about correcting or preventing injustices in the system. Recognition, making sure we have everyone involved at a national and local level in decision making. And then cosmopolitan, thinking about who internationally, thinking about those big international companies, thinking about cross-border issues and impacts. So very briefly, that's what these principles are about. Next slide. And where do we see these primarily being employed? So here are just 3 countries that I've chosen. They are being adopted in many other countries for specifically, for specific policy issues, such as the creation of a sovereign wealth fund, such as the reform of energy taxation. But specifically in the United States, Colombia, and South Africa, we can see these providing the cornerstone of some of the key governance documents. Next slide. And in the US, what we see here is that 62 billion worth of subsidies for the US is available to companies or organizations, as long as they show in their project design how they are going to implement 4 of those justice principles: procedural, distributive, recognition, and restorative. So you have to show how you're implementing those into your project design. And what's very original about the US perspective, if you go to the next slide, please, is that you can see here that they actually take some of the definitions for what these justices are directly from research papers. So you can see I just earmarked 2 directly from some US academics, and there's one where I've been involved in, but my work is covered in the others too. So this is the US perspective, and we can also see from in Colombia and South Africa, again, they also take directly from academic sources for the references. Next slide, thanks. And what this means, essentially, we see this deployment of these justice principles, that really we're talking about the aim of changing the relationship between government, companies, and civil society. So when we're looking for these new finance to deliver a just transition, we're asking the key questions of how do we allocate risk, reward, and responsibility across the 3 different stakeholders of government, companies, and civil society. And that's particularly an issue when we think about coal regions. We think of the legacy impact of these different energy projects in the past. And as we try and approach new energy projects, such as renewables or even critical minerals to come, we need to think, how is the relationship going to change? Who's going to get more of the risk? Who's going to take more of the reward? And where is that responsibility going to be allocated? Next slide, thanks. So in this context, we can see, just from a research perspective, some of the topics and what's been done around the world I've been connected to. We can see this idea of ethics in the just transition being put forward and connected with ESG principles. We can see in ASEAN thinking about what is a just energy transition, essentially a just energy investment after the Paris Agreement in 2015. And then we can think of the idea with petrostates who rely on oil, essentially oil for the majority of their, let's say, economic growth, in terms of where is their part in this energy transition, and the idea there that they should show that they have begun some type of journey in this process. We're not expecting everyone to be at the same level, but more that the journey has begun. Next slide. And as part of that journey that we're basically looking at in terms of thinking about coal regions in particular, let's say, but also think about unlocking finance, is really showing that you're on the steps towards that just transition journey. And what we identify in the research community already, but overlapping into what's happening in practice, that there should be some type of energy justice milestone report where you say, at a particular point in time, this is the level of justice, and we're working over the journey the next 5, 10, 15 years to show you how we've increased the operational focus of justice in the project. And the idea here is that you're trying to show, next slide, you're trying to show that if you can move in this journey, you can actually show that you can reduce the risk, you can increase investor confidence, therefore you can lower financial costs, and you will actually end up increasing jobs in the region. So you will actually, benefit more from directly at a local level from a socio-economic perspective. And anyone who would like a copy of more of this research, just get in touch. It was just published a few months ago in Nature Energy, one of the top journals. So it shows you the research community's perspective on this topic. And then next slide, please. And just a final slide to finish with. This, a lot of this stems also from the perspective of the United Nations, where they're talking about this concept about this idea about future-proofing, that you're making decisions with the best available scientific data, risk management strategies, environmental impact data, and all that will ensure that you lower the risk. And you lower, you can see there the risk at the side, you will lower the risk for disputes also within a region. So you will have less disputes over time, which will mean, in effect, lower financial costs. It will be a lower risk, let's say, projects. And ultimately, that will enable you to have more investment in the region and more opportunities for green jobs. And this is one of the areas that justice research is beginning to focus on, this issue of increasing green jobs, lowering the financial costs for financial institutions, and seeing justice as part of a risk management exercise. So I'll finish there. Thank you very much, and do get in touch if you want any of those publications.
Amazing, Raphael. Thank you so much. And I think, even though sometimes, looking at the stuff, we may think like, oh, well, who reads scientific articles? I really think in some of the actions, we cannot forget about the principles, right? Why we are doing this and how it should be done, even though not always everything can be sort of properly implemented. But I think it is important to bring all those aspects together. Thank you so much. And now, as announced, we will move to the panel of case studies, and we brought to you both the case studies from developed and developing countries, so global north, global south. I think that exchange is also very important, and we will start with Spain, which is a very interesting case. I'm sure many of you have followed the Spanish just transition journey. And we have a privilege to have Julián Martínez from the Just Transition Institute in Spain, and he'll talk about this mechanism of just transition tenders, and I think you'll tell us obviously more, but it was to allow grid access in Spanish coal regions. But Julián, I'm sure you'll tell us more about this. So over to you, and thank you very much for being with us.
Perfect, Andre. Thank you very much, of course, to you and to the Coal Regions in Transition Initiative for having the Spanish government invited here and to tell a little bit about our experience. Just to give a little bit of context about coal in Spain, even though we are not the most coal-intensive country in the world for sure, coal did play a very important role in Spain, especially since the 70s and the oil crisis. To give you a bit of a summary, in the 90s, there were around 45,000 coal miners working in Spain. And just 6 years ago, we had 15 coal power plants in operation. So coal was not a minor thing in our country. In contrast, in just this last 6 years, we've gone from 15 coal power plants to a scenario of complete coal phase out in the country. So all coal power plants are currently either already shut down or in the process of shutting down or are under shutdown plans by their owners. So we are facing a complete phase out of coal in the country around 2025 approximately. And of course, the key question here for us was that coal was so concentrated in some specific regions in the country, like Asturias or León, that even though coal represented only 15% of our electricity mix 6 years ago, which is a lot for a diversified energy mix as the one we have, even if coal only represented 15% of our electricity mix, it represented everything for the economy of the coal regions in the country. So certainly we had to put forward a just transition agenda to ensure that an energy transition and ecological transition in Spain did not leave anyone behind, right? So from a institutional framework point of view, we enacted a just transition strategy with an urgent action plan for coal regions, and we signed tripartite agreements with both sectors involved in coal, which is coal mining and coal power plants. And these tripartite agreements, the key parties, meaning trade unions, the companies owning the coal power plants, and the Spanish government, sit down in the same negotiation table to ensure that the process of shutting down mines and coal power plants implied just transition commitments for the regions affected. And of course, to implement all these policies, we created the Just Transition Institute as a government body dedicated only to just transition policies, which is where I work. So what can you hear me well? Because I think there's some comments
I can hear you well, Julián.
All right, perfect. So we started deploying just transition policies, meaning public funds to support municipal infrastructure projects, economic support for business plans and business investment projects in the areas. We are financing environmental restoration. So we are doing a lot of things. But one key challenge we faced was that often coal regions, it was very hard to promote alternative business and investments in coal regions because they were far away from the main economic poles in the country. However, we saw that these coal regions in Spain had incredible renewable energy resources. May it be wind because they were close to the mountains, may it be solar power because we are in Spain and we have solar power pretty much everywhere. So these coal regions had this key advantage that it was not clear how to make advantage of them because renewable energies are very good at creating jobs when you take into account the entire industrial value chain, but renewables are not that good at creating local jobs, especially compared to coal mining or coal power plants, which are very labor intensive. So how could we use renewable energies to promote job creation in coal regions? So we came up with just transition tenders, which is that when usually in most European countries, grid access for renewable energies or any electricity installation is given by chronological order. So first comes, first served.
Julián, sorry, shall we move to the next slide?
No, it's okay here. It's
okay
okay here. Thank you. So if you're in an electricity installation, a renewable energy installation, and you want to connect to the grid to invest and put your solar panels or your wind farms, you just request it, and if you fulfill the technological requirements, you're given access to the grid. So in chronological order. So what we did is that, okay, instead of giving this incredible resource, which is grid access, which is scarce, because not any project can connect to the grid, because the grid gets saturated and it can hold so many projects at the same time. So this we said, okay, instead of giving away this resource, we're going to tender it. And we're going to tender this with socioeconomic criteria so that we create a competition for renewable energy projects to compete between each other. And it is the best renewable energy project in terms of job creation, social impact in the territory, which gets the grid access and allows the project to make investments and make it real. So this was a complete innovation, and we are still learning a lot about this. But it's been a great instrument to mobilize private investments. I will tell you a little bit more about it later. But in our first experience, the awardee of the Just Transition tender will create more jobs through renewable energies and associated projects that there were in the coal power plant in Teruel, in one of the coal regions. So we've seen an enormous potential for this instrument. And what's key about this is that it implies no public funds, because what you are tendering is a public resource already out there, which is grid access. And this makes this instrument quite universal. It can be used by pretty much any country, because it's not linked to the economic on the tax power of your country, of your state, but it's linked to how do you change or how you modify the regulation regarding grid access. So what kind of socioeconomic criteria are we using in these tenders? As you can see in this example, this is for a new tender we are launching in Valle del Guadiato in Córdoba. We evaluate, of course, some technology and project maturity and environmental impacts, but the biggest chunk of our evaluation is socioeconomic impacts. And here we evaluate total jobs, specific jobs for coal workers, jobs for women, which is super important in coal regions because the labor market in these regions is super masculinized, super male dominated. So it is important for us to use this public instrument to support specifically the creation of jobs for women here to revert that trend. We evaluate the reskilling in terms of number of hours and attendees that the company is going to offer to people living in the coal region. We evaluate distributed energy resources that the company is going to install to reduce the energy bills of people living in coal regions. And also we evaluate local investments and whether you are opening your project for the participation in economic terms of locals. And what's important here is that in order for renewable energy plants, renewable energy projects to create jobs, it's not only about the jobs you are creating directly, but about who you are partnering with in coal regions. So local companies, local NGOs, etc., to partner with them, collaborate with them, help them improve and create additional jobs. So we are taking into account here not only energy jobs, but any kind of job creation that is helping diversify coal regions. If you go to the next slide, Andrew.
Julián, could you can I give you 1 more minute? One and a half?
Perfect.
Thank you.
Perfect. And this is just to give you a very brief portrait, a picture of what was the result of our first just transition tender interval. So we tendered 1.2 gigawatts of grid access, and the result was a 1.5 billion euro investment in energy, renewable energy projects in solar PV, wind, and energy storage. And this project encompasses renewable industry in terms of they are creating a factory for solar trackers in the territory, an electrolyzer factory for hydrogen, you name it. They are partnering with local agriculturalists to promote local resources and agriculture. And the biggest result is that, as I was saying before, through renewable energies, we are going to create more jobs than there were in coal in this area, which is a big success for us. And we expect that maybe other states, other countries will look at this instrument and will see its potential. And thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And yeah, I think we can, I think I'll train right. We will share some of the slides later on. I saw, Julián, you have some resources. Maybe you can even post them now in the chat box or something, right? Where people can study more your case. I think it's a fascinating one. Thank you so much. And I have an appeal to all the panelists. There are already 2 questions in the Q&A section. So, you know, I may, some of them are fascinating. So you can, when you have a moment, review them as you speak, as we move on with the agenda. So now we will go to Chile and Philippines and to Dhruva Kannan from RMI, and he'll tell us about 2 fascinating finance transactions or mechanisms secured by private energy providers to support early retirement of coal-based power plants. And I think looking at your slides, I can tell you it's quite complex, but I think it's a very interesting, concrete way of I guess, supporting the transition. So Dhruva, over to you. Thanks very much for being with us.
Thank you. Happy to be here. And thank you for having me. Great intro, Andre. And yes, complex, but hopefully I can do my best to break it down and show the real value add. Next slide, please. Hi, everyone. My name is Dhruva. I'm with RMI. For those who might be unfamiliar, we are an international clean energy think tank focused on securing a clean, prosperous, zero carbon future for all. We work across a couple of verticals: electricity, buildings, transportation, and industry. And we use a slew of tools, including but not limited to policy, technology, and climate-aligned finance to achieve those goals. Next slide, please. So on the topic of coal-managed phase-out, RMI has put out a couple of pieces of thought leadership over the last, I would say, 2 years. These are 3 of them that I've selected here to share with you all. If you have the time, I would even just read through the executive summaries. They're a great intro to what coal-managed phase-out is and what climate finance specifically for coal-managed phase-out can look like. I think I have 1 animation if you click next. Today, we'll be focusing on the first, the coal to clean success stories. I'll be presenting 2 of those, 1 in Chile and 1 in the Philippines. And I think these will do a pretty good job of answering at least one of the questions in chat about offers for the private sector and opportunities to invest in coal-managed phase-out transition. Next slide, please. So the first one, like I mentioned, is in Tocopilla, which is in the Antofagasta region of Chile. It's in the northern portion of Chile that also does have a lot of renewable resources. So basically, what is this transaction? It was a $125 million blended finance loan. It was signed between EECL, Angie Energía Chile, and IDB Invest in the Inter-American Development Bank, their private financing arm. 110 million of that 125 million loan was at commercial read market rates, and 15 million of that is a concessional loan coming from the Climate Investment Fund's Clean Technology Fund. And I think this is really the key. All $125 million in proceeds from this loan was used to actually construct 151 megawatts of onshore wind power. But as you will see on the next slide, this is tied to the shutdown of 2 coal-fired power units. Next slide, please. And this diagram, it may look a little complex, but it's pretty simple in principle. I'm doing my best to break it down. On the left-hand side, you can see the loan value, the 125 million broken out into 110 million in the top bit coming at market rate, and 15 million at a concessional rate, all used to finance 151 megawatts of wind power. But where do the coal units factor in, you might ask? Well, that $15 million concessional tranche coming from the CIF has a $3 per ton carbon floor price attached to it. That is, if ENGIE retires the coal units ahead of schedule, they were slated to retire in 2024. If they were to retire them early, they would be paid how many ever tons they abated from avoided emissions, multiplied by that carbon floor price, and that they keep as kind of interest payment reduction or savings that they do not have to pay back on the loan. This is really a unique financing mechanism, and I think what enabled this transaction to take off and allowed them to retire coal even earlier. Next slide, please. There are a couple key enabling factors in Chile that really allowed this to take off. I would say first, namely, is the Chilean national government's mandate into coal phase-out policy and government support for renewable energy. I don't have time to get into the full specifics, but if you do click into our transition finance case studies, you will see a detailed timeline of all the efforts the Chilean government took in corralling kind of stakeholders from both the generators, independent power producers, the mining sector, the buyers of the power as well. I think it's really worth a read. The financing mechanism was designed by a proactive and innovative MDB, in this case, the IDB. And that concessional loan tranche, I think, was really key to unlock that results-based carbon finance for early retirement. Fourth, there was financial appetite for transition in Chile, and there were creditworthy both borrowers and off-takers that allowed for renegotiation of the coal PPA into a green PPA and lower the cost of debt. And finally, kind of the reality at the time is that renewable energy PPAs, due to the kind of resources in the Antofagasta region and the Chilean markets, were actually cheaper than legacy coal PPAs that industrial buyers were signed to at the time of the transaction. Next slide, please. And this is just a very small tidbit of that timeline from our case studies that's taken out. You'll see 3 rows here. You'll see closer to 20 in our full case study, and I think it's really worth a read. But some of those enabling factors, you can really see the Chilean government for a whole decade between 2008 and 2017 really invested in renewable energy, grid access, all of which drove down the price of renewable energy. And then in 2018, they established a binding schedule for coal phase out by convening a public-private dialogue between generators, the government, and mining companies. What did all of this result in? Well, in 2019, ENGIE Chile and the government agreed to retire the coal units in Tocopilla 14 and 15 by 2024. And as a result of this transition finance case study, they were retired even earlier in 2022. Next slide, please. So now we'll be moving over to the Philippines in Southeast Asia, a completely different transaction structure, but I think one that perhaps might be even more eye-catching for private investors. This was not a kind of loan. This was rather a sale of an IPP-owned coal asset to what we call a special purpose vehicle. ASIN, that is the owner of the SL Tech coal plant, sold the SL Tech coal plant to a special purpose vehicle for about $314 million at the time. $247 million in that special purpose vehicle came in the form of debt from 2 separate banks, and 67 million approximately came in equity from institutional investors. Note that is important, from Insular Life Insurance, the Philippines Government Service Insurance System, and ETM Philippines Holding Inc. And specifically noted here that EPHI is actually a holding company for ASIN themselves, And this is a mezzanine tranche of equity that allows ASIN to retain 100% of their voting stock. This is, I think, key because it allows them to control kind of the proceeds and the cash flows in the special purpose vehicle. The use of proceeds, well, $184 million approximately was used to refinance the original debt of the SLTech coal plant and cover transaction fees. And again, because they have all the voting stock, $130 million is earmarked by ASIN for reinvestment in the company's renewable energy portfolio. Next slide, please. And I think if that was a little hard to digest via words, this diagram does a little bit better of a job. Again, I highly recommend you read the full case study. But in the middle, you have the SPV coal plant. This is SLTech. On the left-hand side, you have ASIN. This plant, ASIN sold this plant to the SPV in the middle, to the group of sponsors and lenders you see on the right-hand side. They provided low-cost financing to buy coal, and in return, they get revenues from the coal asset. What does ASIN get? Well, they get to divest from the coal plant on paper, yet still having the offtake contract until 2040. And the SPV structure allows them to retain the cash flows to the asset and allows for reinvestment of the proceeds into clean energy. Next slide, please. There are, again, a couple set of enabling factors here. One, primarily being the quality of the project and its sponsor, ASIN. ASIN's parent company is the Ayala Group, which has a history of strong financial standing in the Philippines. They are a conglomerate. ASIN already had a corporate target for 100% renewable energy by 2025, a commitment to just transition, and an ambitious CEO that wanted to be a leader in the renewable energy space. I think corporate leadership really drove this deal forward. And secondly, having multiple offtake contracts helped mitigate the risk. You might have noticed on the previous slide that ASIN is obliged to offtake power from SLTech, which lowered the risk for system operators and financiers, as well as they are contractually obligated for operation and maintenance on the SLTech coal plant. The SPV structure itself is key as well. What it did was it re-levered the transaction. And by that, I mean they were able to replace some of the equity with debt, effectively lowering the overall cost of capital for the transaction. And they did follow the Asian Development Bank's ETM structure, which provided kind of a statement of credibility that kind of enticed financial institutions to buy in and sponsor the project. Leading on, they had strong and supportive domestic financial institutions that provided debt and equity and were willing to provide debt and equity for a coal asset for 18 years. This would not be possible, notably, for financial institutions that might have coal exclusion policies. And finally, ASIN and their project partners emphasized the role of investors in allowing the coal plant to retire early, meaning that this protected their investors from potential pushback on coal investment, as this was marketed as a coal transition investment, not an investment in new coal, avoiding any reputational risk there. And next slide, close out really quickly. Again, just a quick view. I highly recommend you go through the case study, read the full timeline, but ASIN's ambition to become a leader in the clean energy transition really drove a lot of the timeline. As you can see, in 2016, they had 90% of their portfolio being coal and a goal of being 100% renewable within the coming decade. So that transition is largely led by their corporate ambition. Thank you. Andre, I'll pass it back to you.
Thank you very much. And also thank you because you were tasked with presenting two cases within the same time limit. So thank you very much for almost sticking to it. So, you will see there is one specific question to you in the Q&A. I'm also being told that maybe first two questions were not visible to all the attendees. I think we fixed that. So let's see whether we'll have the time, but perhaps for some of the more specific questions, it's easier maybe to just answer in writing for everybody's benefit. So if you could ask you for that, Dhruva, that would be great. Otherwise, thank you so much. And finally, the third part of the panel is bringing us to South Africa. And we're very happy to have Jessie Burton, who I'm sure many of you know from both University of Cape Town and E3G. She has also been working closely with South Africa Presidential Climate Commission. However, I think Jessie will restate that as well. She's not representing the commission in that event, but yeah, it is based on sort of on the ground knowledge and work. And obviously, South Africa has always been featured in many events as the first country of the Just Transition Partnership and stuff like that. So talking about the Just Transition mechanism, Just Transition financing mechanism there is fascinating. So Jessie, over to you, and thanks very much for joining us.
Thanks, Andre, and good afternoon or good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for having me. Yes, as Andre mentioned, I'm based at the Energy Systems Research Group at the University of Cape Town and at E3G. But I had worked on supporting the Presidential Climate Commission, the PCC, with the finalizing of this report, but I'm not a government official, so I'll do my best to respond to any questions. A lot of the kind of original thinking and work has been done by two organizations in South Africa, TIPS, Sandy Lowitt, and an organization called Crutham. So a little bit of background. I mean, most people are familiar with South Africa, but for those who are not, next slide, please. We have a very rich just transition kind of policy context. And this goes back sort of 2 decades or more, but in kind of the last 2 or 3 years, there have been a couple of really quick interventions, like very kind of critical interventions. So first of all, we have a national framework on just transition. Raphael mentioned it earlier, that has 3 approaches to justice: distributive, procedural, and restorative. And though you'll see this kind of plays out into the work that's happened over the last few years. We have a subnational, like regional transition strategy. Mpumalanga is our main coal region. It's where 80% of coal is mined, most of the power plants are. So we have very heavily concentrated climate risk there and climate transition risk. Of course, South Africa was the first JETP. So also in 2022, our JETP, our Just Energy Transition Investment Plan, was released, which outlined the needs in the economy around power, EVs, the regional transition from Mpumalanga. So what do we specifically need for workers, for economic diversification and local economic development, for coal mine and coal plant repurposing, that kind of, that you can have a look at it if you're interested in looking at all the programs. And subsequent to that, the JETP PMU, the project management unit, they have also released a JET implementation plan, which has really taken forward some of the governance and institutional strengthening of that has been needed. So we in the investment plan, it was like, this is what we need. And the implementation plan is like getting down to brass tacks. So what are these barriers? How do we unlock them? What are the governance arrangements? And in parallel, the PCC was also working on this. And so they also released earlier this year a set of recommendations on a just transition financing mechanism. Now, the work that was done to that was really trying to look explicitly at like, what are the barriers to scaling up just transition finance, and also seeing that just transition finance is something different just to climate. It's not climate finance alone. But to understand what are those barriers, what do you need to do to overcome them, and what would the institutional arrangements be for overcoming them? And there were kind of, the work that was done found that there were 4 kind of thematic areas, or 4 kind of areas of barrier, if I can say it like that. A lot of conceptual challenges. So no one really recognizes just transition objectives in the financial ecosystem. There's not a set of metrics or like an assessment framework. So what counts as a just transition project? Is this a just transition project? Can I call it that? Is what the financial sector actors kept asking. There's really detailed challenges at a project level. So just transition projects might have really complex risk profiles. They're often small, they're often innovative. So there's very high transaction costs associated to them. They don't know how to find the funding. They don't know, the patient long-term capital doesn't know how to find the project. So there's a big mismatch there. And that kind of leads into, there's a kind of a set of barriers around information and coordination. So exactly, how do you identify the projects? How do you create data around these projects? Who's responsible for what between DFIs, local government, national government, And there's a kind of live discussion in South Africa around just transition washing. So this kind of fear that people will claim that something is just transition, but it's not. It doesn't have enough effort and ambition around justice to be counted. And then there's a lot of market and kind of structural barriers as well. So one of the critical things that keep coming up in the stakeholder discussions is that fundamentally the finance sector is not responsive to justice. And so how do you deal with that? And so in response to that, the PCC developed a set of functions that they kind of said, if we're going to have scaled up workable finance for a just transition, we're going to need a whole lot of functions. And there's 5 kind of critical areas, and those are really project preparation, project assessment, so what counts, projects, mobilizing funding and aggregating. So, all these small projects, can they be bundled in some way? And then a kind of financial engineering component. So, like how do we do the blending and the structuring of a project to make it work? And then there's a kind of more general run around collaboration, reflecting and learning, because actually even just in the 2 years of this project, people learned, as a country, we learned a lot about what counts and how to do just transition. So next slide. Yeah. So in the sense, like successfully financing just transition at scale will depend on all of these functions. And they can be centralized. You could put them in a single entity in a DFI, or you could have them decentralized. And the kind of model now in South Africa is that it's decentralized, but over time you might bring them together into a single institution. And the idea really is that, project origination, so developers, communities, NGOs, or municipalities can have a framework and a tool. And I'm going to talk just about 2 elements next. I'm going to talk about the project assessment framework and matchmaking. But even with that, you need a project preparation facility, matchmaking, blending and structuring capabilities, and that will allow you to scale your just transition impact over time. The other, mobilizing and aggregating, I mean, we have a JETP, but one of the other aspects that kept coming up with stakeholders was this is really just around a lot of focus on the region and in Mpumalanga, but it's very mitigation focused. So what about climate resilience projects and just transition? So there's still a need to mobilize more funding. And of course, there's a need to mobilize more funding since the scale of need is simply so great. Next slide, please. So I'll dive into 2. I mean, in total, I think there's 15 recommendations around a just transition financing mechanism. So I'm just going to focus on 2 for you. The first one was a framework for assessing projects. So the kind of critical aspect there is that a just transition project has to do more than only decarbonization or only development. It's really about linking climate change response to development outcomes through a set of activities and indicators. So in fact, at the time, South Africa has 2 frameworks now. One, it has kind of interoperability with the green finance taxonomy, and it says, okay, you're a project, you meet the green finance taxonomy objective, but you also need to meet some of the socioeconomic objectives and activities. Or you can come as a socioeconomic project, and then you need to do a little bit more effort on one of your green aspects. The other approach has been to say, okay, we have 4 areas. It needs to be climate criteria, so it could be emissions reductions, but it could also be decommissioning and rehabilitation, or input to emissions reductions like grid infrastructure, or capacity building. It needs to be place-based. It's about transitioning in your new economy, so job creation and sustainable infrastructure, renewable energy, mitigation actions. It needs a transitioning out component. So how are you supporting displaced workers? What is the retraining and reskilling work that's going to happen? Or what is the community transition support? And then a set of criteria around equity and inclusion, SMMEs, local content, and that could have metrics like, is it a woman-owned business? Does it target youth or people with disabilities? And so that's really helpful, because now people can kind of say, okay, does my project fit in here? And how do we need to change this over time? And what is interesting is that fundamentally, I think there's probably 70 activities that are actually in both of these frameworks, that are kind of, and there's quite strong agreement about all those things that count, but there can be a little bit of difference between how you weight them, how you count them, the learning process that's gonna happen. And so the process now that will go forward will really be to test a framework, a unified framework, to see, is it applicable in the real world? How do we need to change it? And how do we think about increasing kind of justice ambition over time? Because for now, there's not so many projects in South Africa, but the thinking is that over time, there will be more and more and more projects, and then you make it harder to count yourself as a just transition project. Next slide, and in fact, to the next one after that. And then the other part that's been kind of getting a lot of activity around it is around matchmaking and project preparation. So under the JETP, we've already seen that money is starting to flow. Some is going into national treasury as concessional loans. A lot of it is being dispersed as grant money. And there have been critiques of where that is going and what it's being funded. And there's been a very strong emphasis on technical assistance. And that's been very heavily critiqued. So civil society and business and others keep saying, well, we should be funding projects on the ground, right, that make a really material difference to people in the coal region. And funders keep saying, cool, but which projects? Where's the project? Find it. And where there are projects, they're often very small, like I've said, novel, small ticket size. They haven't had feasibility support, so they're not really like at a business case yet. It's like an idea that someone has. And so the JET PPMU are actually setting up what is called the JET funding platform. It'll be launched at the end of the month officially, and it will basically be to try and support project preparation and get the grant funding in particular to flow to projects on the ground. So beneficiaries will be able to use the project preparation support services that the platform will provide, and the platform will not take the money and hand it across, but will create a place for the funders to fund the projects. And I think this is absolutely it should be a game changer in South Africa, because really even where there's been money coming in, we haven't had the demand to offtake it. And so you have to do both the supply and the demand side as you go. I mean, the other part of this is also that for now, we haven't been able to disperse to real projects, but in the future, hopefully we'll have way more projects and there will be finance. And again, that will come back to mobilizing more finance, having finance that is more flexible potentially. So this is very centered around projects and private sector, but things like, for example, funding like a large-scale workforce transition will need a different kind of thinking about finance. Next slide, please. Yeah, so I mean, so overall, the lessons is that if you want a cohesive financing response as a country, and if you want to sustain and scale that financing, you have kind of broad financial ecosystem challenges. So what is just transition, and these project level specific barriers. And I mean, there's been a big tension here between basically saying, how do we make the finance sector more responsive to kind of inequality and the climate transition, but also saying how in the immediate term do we kind of address these immediate barriers to getting projects going. All these capabilities and functions are needed, and they, from project assessment, matchmaking, SMME support, public finance alignment in government, in National Treasury, for example, and in DFIs, all the way through to socializing just transition with the private sector. And a critical aspect has really been learning and flexibility is key. So you need to be agile, you need to learn, you need to reflect and adapt, but also need to get going because we need projects on the ground. Cool, thank you.
Amazing, Jessie. Thank you very much. And that just leaves me with the pleasure of introducing our final speaker before we move to conversation about some of the stuff we heard. And actually, there's already some activity going on in Q&A and chat box. So please have a look, participate, pose another question, or respond to a question already posted there. But the final word from civil society, and of course, we, as you see, we are covering as many regions and continents as possible. So we are going now to Cambodia, to Bernadette Victorio from Fair Finance Asia. Bernadette, if you could tell us, I guess the presentation will be about justice, about the due diligence related to that in various financial flows, but also about how you guys are seeing this and what you guys are doing. So thank you very much for being with us, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Andre, and thank you so much to the whole regional transition countries in transition for CRITs. Sorry, I'm forgetting the title, but for CRIT, for inviting Fair Finance Asia to this discussion today. We're very happy to share our thoughts on how the just element is being incorporated in the transition finance and energy transition initiatives with a specific focus on Asia, because this is where Fair Finance works. The next slide, please. For those of you who are not familiar with Fair Finance Asia, we are an Oxfam regional program that started in 2018 and funded by SIDA through the Swedish Embassy in Bangkok, Thailand. FFA actually works across Asia, where we have coalitions composed of local civil society organizations across Bangladesh, Cambodia, India, Indonesia, Laos, PDR, Japan, Pakistan, Philippines, Thailand, and Vietnam. FFA is also part of the broader umbrella of Fair Finance International, and our partners leverage the Fair Finance Guide International methodology to assess and benchmark the policies of financial institutions vis-a-vis international sustainability norms and standards. Essentially, we are a regional network of over 90 civil society organizations committed to ensuring that financial institutions' funding decisions are respecting the social and environmental rights and well-being of communities. Next slide, please. So Fair Finance Asia's work in the energy transition or just energy transition space started since 2021. We have been actively tracking various national and regional level initiatives on just energy transition by looking at various aspects such as lending and underwriting of commercial banks that we are also assessing at the national level, including their coal financing footprints of particularly the biggest cross-border investors from FFA countries, and the prospects that they have in their portfolios with regards to renewable energy investments, energy transition mechanisms, particularly one being managed by the Asian Development Bank. And this one is primarily, of course, drawing funding from bilateral donor countries or public funding, and also looking at policy levers being used to redirect financial flows towards climate change mitigation, such as taxonomies that are being developed in the region. And I think there was already a mention of the ASEAN Sustainable Finance Taxonomy in the beginning of the session. But given that simply replacing coal is not the silver bullet or the solution, all possible solutions are, of course, going to cause a new imbalance in the global energy supply chain. We are also looking more deeply into the qualitative aspects of the transition, such as its gendered impacts. And I think, you know, if we open that box of gendered impacts, and probably there has been some thinking also in South Africa, I heard that being mentioned, but we also, as Oxfam, for example, look at the overall care economy or the overall informal economy that surrounds coal-fired power plants that are going to be transitioned. We also look at the emerging rights-based consideration arising from an increased demand, for example, in transition minerals, which we are trying to move the energy transition. And therefore, we are also looking at those issues in balance with asking, you know, stakeholders to transition or phase out coal financing or coal, the use of coal or fossil fuels in general, but also looking at the other side, what would that look like, and what are the new potential issues that would emerge or arise because of such, if such transition is not managed well or strategically. And finally, we also recently launched a JET policy toolkit, which is mostly targeting ASEAN financial and energy policymakers, as well as civil society working on this space. And this toolkit is aimed at facilitating more interagency coordination on energy transition efforts, because as civil society, we are also talking to different agencies. And we notice that sometimes there are also some silos in terms of the approaches there. So this is just looking at the work that Fair Finance is doing in the space of energy transition. Next slide, please. Now, just to also give an overall view of what's happening in the energy transition in Asia, there has already been some discussion on some initiatives there from the Philippines, for example. But overall, we are seeing that Asian financial institutions continue to finance and invest in fossil fuels even after the Paris Agreement, and this was very clear in the research that we conducted in 2021. We have yet to redo the new research on the financial flows, but as of that study, it was very clear that there are still a lot of transition that needs to happen in the portfolios of the banks with regards to their coal financing. And to meet the obligations, to meet their obligations under Paris Agreement, of course, many Asian countries have also taken steps to limit the negative climate impacts of coal through policies, including no new financing for coal-fired power plant projects, adoption of CCS technology to improve the efficiency of coal-fired power plants that are still in operation, and some of them also committing to introduce carbon taxing. However, these policies are, of course, not sufficient to fully phase out coal in the region. And although fewer coal-fired power plants are being constructed, those already in operation and under development will, of course, have another life cycle of 35 to 40 years, which means that the targets for us to transition overall as a region will be missed if we are going for the 2030 time. And this is largely due to the available funding still coming from banks and investors from Asia, but also beyond. And I think this also links to the opening of a while ago when we started the session, that transitioning in one region, especially a region like EU, will have definitely impacts to other regions such as Asia in our case. And what would that look like in terms of one region transitioning faster than the other, but the demand for energy mix and still there for fossil fuels? Where is it going to come from? How swiftly are we going to be transitioning to renewable energy as well in the region if we are still operating some of those fossil fuel technologies? And so through also, we realized that the justice element is not yet fully embedded in climate and energy policymaking in Asia, which exposes underprivileged, under-resourced, and vulnerable groups and communities to social and environmental risks. And obviously, we know this, knowing in our annual benchmarks what's the policy institutions, the policy of financial institutions look like in terms of human rights, transparency and accountability, anti-corruption, gender equality, and using those themes as lenses to assess their lending and underwriting decisions, particularly in the energy sector. And of course, we are also, as I mentioned, we also started looking at large infrastructure projects such as the energy transition mechanism of the Asian Development Bank. And here we already see some, inconsistencies in terms of the implementation of the safeguards, environmental and social policies for this. So for example, they don't require participating governments or companies to suspend the development of planned or under construction coal-fired power plants. If they are transitioning one project in that country, then that country can still continue to develop new coal-fired power plant projects. That's not exclusive. Sorry, that's my alarm. And maybe I think I would go to my last slide at this point, just to sum up. I think, yes, the main conclusion is the justice element is really not there yet. We see that there is still a lot of investment in coal. We see that there is no time-bound transition strategies being developed, both at the financial sector level, but also at the countries in Asia. And this definitely requires a lot of attention. Active investment in renewable energy generation is slowly and gradually happening, but not enough to transition fast enough, because as we say, if it's not a fast transition, it's not a just transition, because the people that will be left behind are already the ones that are living in energy poverty anyway. long-term planning and strategies to mitigate the adverse impacts of renewables. I already mentioned that, looking at the other sides, the new imbalances that would arise from the increased demand on renewable technology parts such as transition minerals. And obviously looking at, the respect for land rights, ethic, and the clear policies for community participation, gender transformative approaches and consultations with civil society. We see that this is really a tick box exercise at the moment. Civil society is usually present in such consultations, but whether their presence is really meaningful or their comments are being taken forward is also something very questionable. Are they there for rubber stamping? And a lot of them also recognize that, and therefore they also have the dilemma. If we don't go, we miss out. If we go, then they will say, yes, we consulted with the civil society. So, and obviously we are looking at the protection of rights of workers, the human rights, due diligence should be strengthened, safeguarding of health, livelihoods, culture, and heritage communities, and active and meaningful engagement of women, looking at the care economy, as I already mentioned a while ago. And I think, finally, I just want to mention that, of course, it's important to also look at the overall financing for just transition, not just in terms of lending, and we also, as civil society, call on more grants to be put into the climate mitigation initiatives so that the debt burdens will also not fall on countries. This is also quite important to pay attention to, especially for countries already struggling to mitigate the impacts of climate change. And yes, protecting the civic spaces that allow for independent checks and balances on jet initiatives. So right now in Asia, we see that this is really shrinking, and jet or energy transition initiatives are becoming a more and more sensitive topic for us to engage in. And therefore, more protection on human rights defenders in this area is important. I will end there, and looking forward to questions if there are any.
Thank you so much, Bernadette. And that brings us to the end of the sort of presentation part. As I mentioned, there has been quite a lot of activity going on. So thank you very much to the panelists for answering questions live. So what I'm going to do now, and please bear with me, all the panelists, hope you like this. So basically, I mean, the questions are quite specific, but I actually like two questions that are very interesting. And me, myself, I was also, in my past life, the policymaker, and this discussion about private-public is quite fascinating. So I like the question here, that was actually the first question posted, which was, what is the deal on offer for private sector? Not in terms of numbers, but what is the business model to profit-seeking actors? And there's also one other related to that, which is basically what needs to be done to mobilize private finance. So what I would like to do is to invite all panelists. Unfortunately, Veronique had to leave us, so I'm sending her apologies on her behalf. But yeah, we have still Raphael, the remaining panelists, with us. So if we could go in the same order as you guys presented, and I would ask maybe to just say a word about how do you think, this enabling environment for private sector, what do you think? And also maybe share a gist of the answer, the question that you answered in the chat box, not to just tell, everything reading what you wrote, but basically what aspect was brought and why that is maybe interesting for our broader audience. We don't have much time. We have 16 minutes. So if we could ask you to kind of stick to maybe 3 minutes per person, just to flag something quickly, that would be great. Raphael, if that's acceptable. Raphael, could we start with you? Thank you.
Yeah, so very briefly, in terms of the private finance, I think, as I quickly said in my presentation, I think there needs to be a realization by the private sector, maybe, that some of the supernormal profits, what economists would refer to, that they will not be available as we move towards a low carbon economy, that some of their expectations have to change there. I would say to counter that, when we think of how private finance can move forward, I wonder, can we see maybe a return to maybe some longer term contracts? So while they may not be earning some of the supernormal profits, there should be some longer term investment contracts available. And why I say that very briefly is, you know, when we are thinking about some of the timeframes of a just transition, we should remember that they were really talking about 15, 20, 25-year periods. If we want to see full investment into these regions and communities, we really need to make, you know, to show that that long-term commitment is made from the, you know, the private sector can benefit, the public sector will benefit too. So that would be my point on that. My very brief point in response to the question that I was asked around where did the justice principles come from, and what level of, let's say, philosophy do we deal with given the different socioeconomic structures? Well, a very brief answer to that, there are many different research papers which you could spend the whole weekend reading, but I will just say very briefly, let's take a lesson from the United Nations, that all the countries have signed up to the different principles and, you know, different documentation on, you know, just transitions, just energy transitions and climate change. And we should go from that perspective. And I also like the perspective that I pointed out from South Africa, America, the US or Colombia, where they just took the definition straight from the leading research articles, because I think we have to stop going back to discuss the philosophical intentions, you know, all the time. We have to begin this journey. Climate change is real, and I really like their approach to say, this is our working definition for now. This is what we'll use for the journey. It may not be perfect, but, you know, we can evolve these definitions over time. So I think choose a definition in a collective way and then build out from that for the journey. Thank you.
Thanks, Raphael. Thank you so much. Julián, if I can ask you now to.
Sure. Well, about the question on well, how can we mobilize private finance for these regions? I would say that we need to, the framework here is that coal regions have economic opportunities beyond coal, and that for us is super clear. I was talking before about renewable energies. Well, let's talk about hydrogen, green hydrogen, for example. In Spain, more than half of our coal power plants are being reconverted into hydrogen production plants. And that's because coal power plants are leaving behind incredible energy infrastructure, access to water, because they need the water access for refrigeration, and good industrial infrastructure. So there are opportunities beyond coal, and of course it is also on the side of the public administration to also incentivize companies to make the most of those opportunities. For instance, in the case of the Spanish government, what we are doing is that in our support instruments for green hydrogen, well, you know, it's a innovative industry that it's receiving public funds and public support in order for it to launch everywhere in Europe and the world. And in our support instruments for green hydrogen, they are based on competitive tenders as well. And in these tenders, we are, one of the evaluation criteria is being located in a just transition area, in a cold region, which means that if you are a hydrogen project that wants to locate in a cold region, you are more likely to receive public funds for your new industry. So there are opportunities here, and also there are instruments that can be used by public administrations to incentivize companies to make the most of these opportunities.
All right, thank you very much. Then let's move to Dhruva.
Yeah, I think in short, my answer to the question of what should be done for private finance is to do more projects, get more projects on the ground. I think project financing comes down to risk return profiles, right? I think generalization broadly that coal transition investment is seen as more risky and generating less returns now. We want to get to a point where that's not the case, where it is de-risked and they are generating more returns. Even already today in different markets, we see different types of investors playing in coal transition finance. We see international, local, regional, commercial banks, right, refinancing debt. Let's say a coal plant initially got debt at 10%, and the company's credit rating improves, and they say, okay, hey, we're willing to refinance your remaining balance at 8%. That's savings to the coal plant owner between the 8 to 10% and the revenue opportunity for the bank. We see institutional investors, right, like government pension funds, like in the Philippines, who say, hey, maybe we want less returns. We're comfortable with 2, 3, 5% returns over 20 to 30 years. We just want something stable, less risky. There's a place for investors like that as well. We've even seen in the United States private equity, and granted in the United States, so take into account capital markets, power generation economics, et cetera. But we wrote a case study about a couple of coal plants owned by a PE fund that actually decided, hey, it's best for us to secure some low-cost debt, refinance the plant balance, and then reinvest, get out of coal and invest in battery storage. That was their path forward. And this is where I might contend respectfully with Professor Heffron here, is that I think there is already an opportunity, and there will continue to be an opportunity for finance, that we cannot do this transition if the message is you have to alter your expectations, rather than the expectations are different than what you think. I think the train for coal managed phase out finance is leaving, and it's time to hop on for finance institutions, right? There is whatever asset class you're looking to invest in, we can find like a project for you. Start with the old coal units that make more sense, that have paid off their project debt, that are less risky at the moment. And as you do more projects, as these get repeated, banks and investors will say, hey, okay, we've seen this done. The risk is lowered. We know how to do transactions like these. Transaction advisory firms will gain more experience with structuring them. Overhead costs for lawyers, everybody will be more familiar with these transactions, and you shift the risk to return profile. They get less risky, they generate more returns.
Thank you so much. And I also see, right, you answered a couple of very specific questions, right, regarding the mechanisms you presented, right? But I think it's difficult to bring that to this forum. I think people should just sort of have a look, right, in the transcript. Yeah, thank you so much.
100%.
And then Jesse, same, whatever, you want to comment on private sector and any of the specific questions.
I think if we knew how to mobilize the private sector and their trillions and trillions and trillions of assets under management, we would all go home, right? This is the most critical question. So we're asking them to do more now than they've ever done before, but they've shown themselves incapable of delivering, I think, at the scale and kind of pace that we need for climate change. And now we're layering the social ambition on top. So I don't know what the answer is. I mean, we've discussed a lot in South Africa, are you calling something just transition because that opens up more potential finance? Or is it just so that banks can say, I have a just transition project? Because those are two really different ways of thinking about the problem. So one, I think maybe we need a way to kind of integrate the ethics kind of discussion on the one hand with this kind of financial engineering and risk and returns and people working in banks, because I don't think those people are really talking to each other. I mean, that's what we learned in the South African process, right? You've got people talking about financial engineering on one hand, and then on the other hand, kind of development practitioners working with communities around how to do something innovative around hemp on a degraded mine. And those worlds are just totally disconnected from each other. And so I hope maybe some of the institutional stuff South Africa is doing will try and bridge that a little bit. So you'll have those financial engineers who can also talk to community-led projects. And I think it's also a symphony. I always talk about the symphony of just transition, but South Africa has plenty of people investing in renewable energy in the coal region, like tens of billions of rand. So what is that? Probably almost 10 billion euros. But there are no requirements around being socially ambitious. The social ambition has been lost from our renewables program. So you could layer these kinds of innovative ideas that happened in Spain, on grid. We used to do that on generation, and it's fallen out of our auction system. So you kind of have to, as government, both shape all these different sectors and think about how to promote the developmental aspects at the same time. And then my specific question was around barriers for community-led projects. And I think it's very clearly around scale, access. You know, I think they're kind of very small scale re-granters on the ground who are doing tiny micro grants to communities who are trying to do something often more developmental, like food gardens and that kind of thing. But not always. Sometimes the community-led projects are still potentially commercial. So there's kind of a multiple matrix of what is commercial and non-commercial. It's not only about who's originating them. But I think the scale is a big challenge. So helping and kind of one of the cool things in South Africa is that CSO, civil society, are creating a community just transition fund. So they'll support community originated projects to trial them, and it'll be experimental, and they'll do interesting and innovative things. And some of those I think will be able to go to bigger funders over time and scale, but that will take us some years, I think, to kind of get the answer. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Yes, I agree. Yeah, if we were able to solve this with this webinar, that would be very rich. Thank you so much. Jesse and Bernadette, would you like to also comment on some of this? I mean, I don't think it was a specific question to you, but yeah, I would like your perspective on that private sector.
Yeah, sure. I think I tend to agree that, you know, there's probably an incompatibility here with private sector financial institutions objectives with social objectives, because the bottom line is not necessarily aligned with the projects that are probably locally led, or adaptation mechanisms that are probably something arising from the communities that are impacted. And we know that there are a lot of innovations that are there, I think already mentioned by Jesse. And there's really a need to, you know, upscale or scale up those innovations, but at the same time, private sector financial institutions also have to start developing, you know, innovative products and services in order for them to be able to also accommodate such new, you know, projects and ideas. And yeah, I think it's important for also, I think the main message is also to move away from focus so much on risks rather than impacts. So I think there should always be a balance between what they look at, you know, as risk for them, but also what is impactful to the community and what is something that's could really support social, you know, and environmental objectives for the communities where these projects are being implemented. I'll keep it short there.
Super. Thank you very much. And if I can now please ask my colleagues to display the final slide. So first of all, I'd like to thank all of you for giving us 90 minutes of your precious time, especially for, you know, in the era that we, you know, there's so many events. So the fact that you gave us your time and attention, and you posed questions and engaged is very humbling. Thank you very much. We will continue working on those topics, you know, with various activities under the Initiative for Coal Regions in Transition. Just to restate what Veronique said in her initial welcome, you can register, and we have a QR code for you to scan, but you can also look for Just Transition platform in the web search. So please join us 15th, 16th October virtually. I mean, some people have registered already and will be attending in person. Now it's only available in virtually. And there's also the YouTube channel of DG Energy at EU Energy, where you will be able to download the entire video watch the entire video from this webinar. And as we mentioned, the presentations will be shared with all participants, so please feel free to share them further. This was an open event. And with that, I'd like to thank everybody again, wish you all the best in your endeavors related to just transition and other topics. And yeah, I hope to see you on some other occasions very soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.